She was bound wide open beneath the scorching Nebraska sky, and she was wailing without uttering a sound, the sort of wail your thoughts unleash when your voice has long since faded. Lila Hayes was only 19, shoeless, grimy, barely aware. Her arms stretched taut above her head, her feet lashed so wide the cords bit into her flesh. And she was abandoned there like livestock, left to scorch until she shattered. Most people in Cheyenne would have galloped right by her that afternoon. The plains are vast and merciless, and folks tend to their own affairs. But if you'd been there, you'd have noticed her gaze first. Huge, glazed, petrified, as if she'd already resigned herself to perishing right there. The breeze kept flinging grit across her cheeks. She couldn't even brush away her own tears. Her tone was hoarse. She kept murmuring, "Please," but nobody was hearing. You ever witness someone so adrift that your heart clenches before your brain even registers it? That was Lila, deserted in the swelter by the sole fellow who ought to have shielded her, her stepdad, Harlan, a harsh soul who guzzled more than he toiled and figured a lass had just one role. After her ma passed, he reckoned Lila would step in for her. When she balked, he hauled her to the remote corner of his spread and secured her to a rail like that. He warned her she'd grasp her role by dusk. Hours dragged on. The landscape wavered like simmering broth. Her gullet parched to powder. Her limbs quivered so fiercely the cords clinked. She imagined she caught vultures wheeling overhead, but she was too frail to raise her chin. Then something shifted. The earth began to thud, gentle at first, then nearer. A lone pony, Hayes billowing in its wake. The horseman reined up sharp when he spotted her. Gideon Hale, 47 years old, the cattleman who'd endured dry spells, demise, and every sort of hardship the frontier could hurl at a guy. But nothing braced him for the vision of a young woman roped out like chum under the vast heavens. He halted in the stirrups, not from fright, but from sheer astonishment. He dismounted easy, boots sinking into parched turf. Lila attempted words, but only a rasp escaped. Gideon crouched by her side. His silhouette at last offered her a sliver of relief from the glare. He brushed the cord at her wrist. It was drenched in her perspiration and crimson. He scanned the barren grassland, half bracing for some beast to slink from the weeds. Then he uttered 5 soft words, words she'd carry forever. Nobody merits this. He drew his blade, but the instant he severed her last bond would be the instant her entire world tilted, for good or ill. And here's the question I want you to mull over before we press on. If you were that cattleman planted in that blaze, eyeing that young woman, what call would you make? Would you spur away, or plunge into the sort of mess most guys don't walk out of? When Gideon slashed the final cord, Lila almost toppled ahead. He snatched her before she smacked the soil. Her frame felt feather-light, nearly empty, as if dread had gouged away half of her. He hoisted her onto his mount with the sort of tenderness a fella employs when cradling something he can't mend but won't let slip. The trek back to Hale Homestead dragged, weighted down. The grassland sprawled endlessly, stifling and still, save for Lila's ragged breaths. Gideon kept chatting to her in a soothing tone, not probing, just basic stuff like, "You're okay now, and hang in there if you can." Most fellas out west bark rough, holler loud, but Gideon spoke like he aimed not to spook an injured critter. And just then, that's precisely how Lila felt. Hale Homestead hugged the Platte River, a modest outfit holding firm, mostly 'cause Gideon labored beyond what his years should permit. When he bore Lila indoors, the elderly cook, Miss Harlan, no relation, took one glance and almost fumbled her pot. She jabbed toward the guest quarters and declared, "Heavens above, lay that poor thing down afore she wilts." Lila hovered on the edge of awareness, her mouth chapped, her blouse sodden with sweat and muck. She resembled somebody who'd been scourged for merely existing. Miss Harlan tended her scrapes little by little, while Gideon fetched water and clean linens. He lingered by the threshold, thumbs hooked in his belt, not wishing to crowd her. Most guys would have gawked. He didn't. He kept his stare downcast, like he was awaiting leave just to assist. When Lila roused at last, the light was dipping behind the stable beyond the pane. For an instant, she bolted upright in terror, convinced she was still lashed in that meadow. Then she spied Gideon perched on a stool beside her cot. He'd nodded off, Stetson tipped low over his brow. He appeared wearier, sans the trail dust on his features. Almost kind. She breathed a lone query. "Why'd you aid me?" Gideon stirred and scrubbed his eyes. He regarded her for a drawn-out beat. His words emerged even. "'Cause somebody should have stepped up for you ages back." Lila tried to prop herself, but her sides throbbed. Gideon edged nearer, easing in so she wouldn't startle. He aided her to recline against the bolsters and placed a tumbler of water in her grasp. She sipped like she hadn't savored liquid in ages. Perhaps she hadn't. That evening she jolted awake, quaking, pulse pounding, sure she detected Harlan's spurs clomping in the corridor. Gideon was stationed beyond her portal, hat cradled in his lap, standing vigil. He didn't enter. He merely murmured in a deep, steady timbre that she was secure and he'd hold post till daybreak. She wept soundlessly for what felt like eternity before slumber reclaimed her. Something odd stirred then, a faint flicker of optimism. Not sufficient to lean on him wholly, but enough to inhale sans trembling. Still, she knew her stepdad Harlan wasn't through. A brute like him never releases that simply. And here's the genuine storm gathering. What do you reckon Harlan did next, once he twigged Lila was missing from where he'd stashed her? Harlan Hayes wasted no time piecing together that Lila had vanished. A sort like him always figures the universe is in his debt. When he cantered back to that pasture and discovered only the snipped lines and her tracks in the powder, his mug flushed crimson as a poker fresh from the fire. He booted the rail so fiercely it rattled. Then he hawked into the earth and vowed he'd haul her back, come what may. By the following midday, he was already thundering toward Hale Homestead. Locals at the trading post mentioned spotting him flogging that weary nag like the fiend was nipping at his heels. In a manner, perhaps he was. Back at the spread, Lila perched on the veranda, swaddled in a throw. She still seemed frail, but her stare was sharper. She eyed the skyline like she anticipated strife to stroll straight from it. She was spot on. Gideon emerged and swabbed his palms on a cloth. He glimpsed Harlan barreling along the rutted lane and grumbled something beneath his breath that most hands mutter when rails snap or gales brew. Nothing civil. Then Harlan vaulted from his pony and stormed up the risers. Lila recoiled, but Gideon positioned himself afore her, serene yet resolute, like a gent primed to tackle a raging steer, even knowing he might get flattened. Harlan jabbed toward Lila and snarled about kin duties and vows and lawful claim. Gideon didn't so much as twitch. He crossed his arms, rooted firm as a silo side, and laid out the facts blunt as noon. Lila wasn't chattel. She wasn't a bride he could seize, and she damn sure wasn't departing with him. Harlan ramped up the volume then, mighty loud, enough to scatter the hens yonder the outhouse. But Gideon held his pitch. He just inched forward, locked eyes with Harlan, and delivered a line that hushed the entire dooryard. "You touch her once more, and you'll reckon with me up front and the badge after." Harlan attempted to glare him out, but a presence like Gideon's has a way of reminding others of their station. After a stretched silence, Harlan retreated, swung aboard his mount, and loped away. But he craned back repeatedly. Types like him never quit, sans a scheme. Within the cabin, Lila drew a full breath at last, but she sensed this wasn't concluded. And Gideon did too. That dusk, as Gideon passed her rocker en route to snag his duster, she jerked so sharply she nigh spilled her mug. He halted, withdrew, and said sorry, though he'd wronged naught. Lila breathed that she hadn't intended to spasm like that. Gideon assured her mending demands patience, and nobody hurries her in this abode, 'cause strife has a knack for circling back, particularly when it feels slighted. Before we shift to the following stretch, take a leisurely pull from your brew or cuppa and ease in alongside me. Share what the clock reads where you sit and from whence you're tuning in. And if you dig tales spun this manner, go ahead and hit follow so you don't skip what's coming. Though Harlan quit Hale Homestead that eve, but all could sense from his grip on the lines that he wasn't finished. A fellow like him doesn't gulp his ego. He gags on it. Then he hurls it forth at the nearest scapegoat. 3 nights on, the clash rolled in. It crept gentle initially, merely the clop of a steed someplace in the gloom. Then a second, trailing it. Gideon was on the stoop with a lamp, inspecting the latch on the storm door. When he caught it, he lowered the light, cocked an ear a spell, then hollered inward. "Keep near," made Miss Harlan peek from the scullery and hiss that she sensed malice loping on the gusts. She wasn't off. The barrier groaned. 2 horsemen materialized. Harlan Hayes ahead, and trailing, a gent who screamed peril, even in the murk. Lanky, slit-eyed, hide jacket softened from countless rough dawns. They dubbed him Zeke Harlan, unrelated. He was the breed of gunslinger who spared words, 'cause lead was his tongue. They halted by the stable. Harlan bellowed he'd come to reclaim his due. Zeke loomed mute astride, one palm hovering his iron, the other drumming his thigh like the fray already wearied him. Gideon descended the stairs. He didn't yell. He didn't claw for his peace, neither. He simply planted there, heels dug, and frame set like the full outfit balanced on his poise. Harlan bayed that Lila was his. The dooryard fell mute. Even the fowl stilled as if they grasped the peril. Gideon replied even and deliberate, the sort of deliberate that prompts another to second-guess his retort. Lila's unbound here, and she's remaining. That sufficed. Zeke dismounted, shooter half-cocked. Lila inhaled sharp from the entry. Gideon raised a palm in a hushed caution. Then all blurred swift. Zeke triggered first. The crack ripped the ether and nicked Gideon along the bicep, shredding his sleeve and spilling red. Gideon reeled a tick, clutching his limb, but he held. Zeke blasted anew, but his round strayed when Harlan's pony shied abrupt, churning loam and unsettling Zeke. That was when Gideon righted, sighted brief, and planted a slug in Zeke's collar, whirling him earthward. Zeke crumpled to a squat, and his iron tumbled to the muck. Harlan lunged, howling oaths. Gideon snagged a lariat from the rail, whirled it brisk, and the noose clamped snug round Harlan ere he twigged he was snared. Gideon hauled fierce, and Harlan kissed dirt nose first. Miss Harlan afterward claimed she yearned to applaud, but her myths quivered overmuch. By first light, both gents were lashed to their ponies, battered and bowed, as Gideon herded them to Cheyenne to square with the marshal. Lila beheld them fade along the trail, her respiration uneven, but her eyes livelier than in ages. But here's the bit you ought to ponder presently. What unfolds when a gal who's only tasted terror at last claims the shot to forge her path? And what'll she pick once her spirit starts to mend? Gideon cantered home from Cheyenne shy of midday. The warmth was balmy, not vicious like the morn he'd first stumbled on Lila. His pony ambled languid, nigh serene, as if it fathomed the threat had ebbed. When he gained the yard, Lila slipped from the dwelling with tentative strides, uncertain whether to grin or weep. Perhaps the pair. Gideon alighted and passed the bridle to her. His timbre was mild. It's over. The marshals got him. They won't hound you more. Word in Cheyenne already murmured Harlan might swing come thaw, but scant faith in the bench back then. And Zeke, well, some reckoned they glimpsed him hobbling from the lockup a pair nights hence, seeping through his wrap and veering south to Oklahoma. Yarns fleet quick out west, but facts amble. For the nonce, Harlan rots in irons, confronting the reckoning he deemed untouchable. And wheresoever Zeke hobbled, he'll recall this spread each time his flank twinges. Lila clasped that rein like a relic. For the first stretch in forever, her fingers held steady. The ensuing days bore a fresh hue, airier. The spread wore a peace that enfolded her like a down comforter. She lugged pails to the stalls. She curried the steeds, her digits gliding through knotted tresses with a hushed intent. When Gideon showed her to patch a barrier, she let loose the first true chuckle he'd heard from her. It was modest, but it breathed. Recovery creeps. It strolls, not sprints, but you could trace it in her. Each dawn she rose a tad taller. Each twilight she voiced a smidge freer. She commenced to trust she belonged in this realm, a spot not forged in fright, but in her own picks. One midday along the stream, she confided to Gideon a plain truth. I feel secure here. He dipped his chin and replied that security is the opening stride, not the finale. She queried what kept it. He quirked a grin in that worn cattleman fashion and said, thriving, truly thriving. The brand where you claim yourself, not the mold somebody shoved on you. That eve, Lila lingered on the veranda as the orb sank after the willows. She seemed maturer somehow, not in spans, but in grit. The globe had stripped nigh all from her. Yet hither she stood, piecing herself anew on a spread that reeked of fodder and sun-baked loam. And perhaps that's the nugget nestled in her yarn. You can be yanked to the blackest nook a soul can endure. You can be forsaken, wounded, daunted, and dead certain you'll never climb anew. But the mortal ticker's bull-headed. It gropes for gleam. Even when it scarce recalls gleam's feel, it sprouts back, gradual but sure. Each instant somebody tenders a dash of grace. So let me pose this. If existence ever towed you through your private badlands, would you muster the nerve to reboot? And if you crossed paths with somebody astray in the haze, would you halt like Gideon or lope past? If this yarn's held you wrapped, smack like so others can catch it. And if you crave more yarns woven languid and true like this, by all means subscribe so you don't miss the morrow's jaunt. Now draw a lungful, nurse your Joe, and drop in the remarks whence you're piped in from, and the hour it strikes yonder.